Welcome to RenMac Off Script, where we discuss markets, economics, policy, history, and life. It is August the 2nd, 2024. I'm Jeff DeGraff.
I'm Neil Dutta.
I'm Steve Pallett.
As a reminder, all the charts that we reference are posted to our Twitter account at RenMac LLC and our LinkedIn page. Well, it's Payroll Friday. That's always an important day. We had a Fed meeting, though, earlier this week. The Fed, I know it was priced in for a pause, but what are you thinking? I mean, did they stub their toe pretty hard on this one, or where are you, Neil?
Well, I would just say they stepped on a nail. Thankfully, I don't think they stepped on a bed of nails, so that's welcome. Look, if all you're going to always do is just do what the market's pricing in, then what's the point of you being there? I mean, sometimes you have to exercise a little bit of judgment and move accordingly. And I think the writing has been on the wall for the Fed to recalibrate policy now for months. They didn't do it in July, maybe because they felt like they had to set things up. Well, guess what? The data is setting it up for you now. The fact is that the labor market report today was not good. Okay. The unemployment rate rose 0.2%. We're at a cycle high now of 4.3%. I think it's interesting. Governor Waller, a couple of weeks or months ago, talked about how he wanted to get to a point where he wasn't taking inflation data out to the second or third decimal point. Well, guess what? Now they might have to do that with the unemployment rate because it was a soft 4.3. It was 4.25%. But either way, up is up. And I think it's interesting to see people rationalizing the increase in unemployment. I mean, well, the prime age employment rate didn't go up. Most of it was temporary layoffs, so on and so forth. Ultimately what matters is the unemployment rate, because that's what goes into the summary of economic projections. The unemployment rate is now several tenths higher than where the Fed thinks it's going to be by the end of the year. All right? That's it. That's enough reason to begin recalibrating policy, in my opinion. With respect to the Sahm rule, I had the good fortune of being on Bloomberg earlier today, and the guest that was right before me was Claudia Sahm herself, famous for the fabled Sahm rule. Well, that did trigger, and Claudia was very quick to point out that just because it triggered doesn't mean that we're in recession. It's very neatly forecasted previous recession. It doesn't mean it's going to, trigger a recession now. That's, things aren't stable from one cycle to the next. And she was very important, quick to point that out. But, look, I think from the Fed's point, like, why would you want to wait to find out? Right. I mean, obviously, the balance of risks have clearly changed. When you look at the establishment survey of payrolls, maybe there was a Hurricane Beryl effect. You did see more people sort of off the job because of bad weather. But ultimately, when you look at the establishment data, you saw slowing in the work week, slowing in hourly earnings, and weaker jobs growth. If Beryl was going to have a big effect, you'd expect. You wouldn't expect that kind of composition, right? I mean, people would still be on the job. Maybe their hours would go down, but as a result, their earnings would go up. So, I mean, I think that there's some meaningful deterioration even after the Beryl effect is accounted for. So there's no inflationary impulse from the labor market, and that's been evident for months. So I think the Fed needs to get on with it. And what I would say, I think they start with 50. I think they start with 50 because I think they need to make up for July. So I think it's sort of a 50, 25, 25, basically 100 basis points worth of rate cuts straight out the gate.
This year.
And look, I mean, the one thing I will say, because, look, this is not, we talked about this earlier, right? There's no troubled asset relief program. There's no resolution trust corporation. There's no time cover like committee to save the world, right? I mean, this is all about monetary policy being too tight. Okay, that's what this is about. And that means that the solution is very obvious. It just means you need less restrictive monetary policy.
Yeah.
And so the good news is that the Fed has a lot of ammunition to deal with the problem. If the medicine doesn't take, just keep hitting it more. All right. And until things turn around.
I mean, there are 130 basis points right now with the 2-year effectively at 4%, Fed funds 533-ish. So they're 125, 130 basis points tight. That's the most they've been for the cycle. And so, your idea of 50 is not a long putt, right? I mean, you have to that's still restrictive policy, right? Your policy is still restrictive as long as that curve is inverted, where Fed funds are higher than the 2-year yield. So there's a lot of room for that to come down. What's interesting, we had a dark cross in the 2-year yield this week, right? What does that mean? It means the 50-day crossed under the 200-day moving average on the 2-year yield. Historically, if you say, okay, well, when that happens, if I go out the next 3 months, how does that look? It's very defensive in terms of what works in the equity markets. And it's defensive because the risk is that the Fed has pushed things into recession, right? And so it takes on this more defensive look. We had not been seeing that. That was not something that we were concerned about. We were seeing beta do well. We saw the breadth expansion. All those things were still in play, which just said to us, soft landing, soft landing. That started to change pretty meaningfully in the last 48 hours with this crack. And we saw yesterday credit spread started to widen. We saw beta come under pressure, high beta versus low beta. We saw the banks come off their overbought condition, which is some concerns around the potential for a degradation of asset quality. We saw cyclicals underperform the defensives, and these things are severe enough that I think the Fed's got to pay attention to this. I mean, I don't think we can go 6 weeks. Do you think we can go 6 weeks with the Fed sitting on their hands? I mean, there's a lot of data between here and there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope is that you see some maybe inklings of stability just because, maybe you get a better retail sales number, a consumer not falling apart. Maybe you see some stabilization in housing activity as mortgage rates fall. I mean, there are some things that you can kind of think about. But look, I mean, ultimately, it's employment that is the most important single indicator that the Fed has. I mean, those are the things that we look at the most, and yeah, it's not good. And I mean, I don't think that the Fed should get to a point where they're thinking about an intermeeting move. But look, I mean, if the markets kind of get carried away here, don't be shocked if you get like sort of a summer, August, September 2007 situation where they've released a statement in August where they're talking about how they're monitoring what's going on and how they stand ready to act, and then they go 50.
Right.
Now, obviously, that's a 2007 example, but look, I mean, I don't think we're in I don't think that's what this is. I want to make that clear, but I'm talking more about from the perspective of how would you communicate something.
Yeah. What's the thing for Jackson Hole this year?
You'll like this one, Jeff. Reassessing the effectiveness and transmission of monetary policy. So again, it's always about how they're fighting the last war, right? I mean, so they should have had the Jackson Hole Symposium in December of 23 or January of 24 when we were debating about why hasn't policy slowed the economy. Now, this is what the theme is, and the economy is clearly slowing. So it's one of these things where it's like, look, I mean, Wall Street always kind of makes fun of the Fed. It's like nice parlor sport, but it's kind of like Wall Street year ahead pieces, right? I mean, you put out a year ahead piece, it's got a shelf life of about a week, and then you move on to the next thing. So, I mean, there are lots of things. We have we have an inflation report coming up in a couple of weeks. We have another jobs number. We obviously have the minutes. We have Jackson Hole. But I definitely think that the tone of the Fed's rhetoric is going to abruptly shift. I mean, I will say one thing that was interesting about the Fed meeting is that the statement itself was not that dovish. It was Powell that was dovish.
You're right.
If you read the statement and that's all you got, you would say that there was a pretty low bar for them to not cut in September, right? I mean, so the statement in my opinion was a little bit more hawkish than I would have liked. But Powell kind of, was the reason why the markets took everything in a more dovish posture that day. But ultimately, it's the data flow that matter. And the data flow are telling the Fed, I think, very clearly that you're late and you need to play catch up. And the good thing is that you're not very late. So you can, kind of, like I said, you can start with 50 right out the gate. Maybe you do another 50. I think 50, 25, 25 or 50, 50, 25. I mean, I think that's not a unreasonable expectation, in my opinion. I mean,
so let me throw this grenade in there. Where do we set now, because we're so close to the election, of this being politicized? I think, Steve, you were mentioning
that ship has sailed, my man.
Yeah, that's 100%.
That ship has sailed, my man. I mean, it's sort of like, But if you, I mean, I'd love to hear what Steve thinks about this. But if you're the Republicans, this is like actually working both ways, right? Because now you can basically say like the reason the Fed has to do this is because the Biden-Harris economy is not doing well,
Right,
right?
right.
Unemployment is up. This is the Fed that is basically packed with Biden appointees. Okay, Lisa Cook, Philip Jefferson, like all these people. These are all Biden appointees. Okay, so they have a strong case to make. I mean, so look, it's the Fed wouldn't be thinking, I mean, the markets wouldn't be thinking the Fed would be going 50 if things were all, sort of coming up sunshine, rainbows, and roses. I mean,
100%.
so
Yeah,
I think
I
they
would
have a
just
good case to tell either way.
both sides are going to make their politicized points. I mean, you have progressives, I think, like Senator Elizabeth Warren saying if Powell doesn't cut, then that's political. Obviously, Republicans said if he's going to cut that close to the election, it's political. I think Neil raises an interesting point, which is, I think before there was maybe a stronger conviction that the Fed was cutting on a clearer path to the softer landing, whereas now, are you sort of cutting from a position of weakness? Are you cutting because you fear that there's something wrong with the economy? And I'd be surprised if Republicans don't try to highlight that narrative that Neil laid out, I think, pretty eloquently. But they have maybe other issues right now in terms of their political messaging. Maybe we can talk about as well.
Well, the buzzword this week was weird, which I don't really understand. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, right? So we gotta be a little careful with that one. But what's the latest in the polls? Things I'm seeing, and I don't pay that much attention to this stuff. I wasn't an IHOP yesterday though, and I will say these two elderly ladies behind me were talking, and it was fantastic. I mean, this is the middle of Connecticut, so kind of right there. And I mean, it was like it should have been on CNN. It was just fantastic to hear the complaints and both sides. So it was well represented. Let's put it that way. So there was no syrup throwing or anything that was out of hand. They weren't asked to leave, but it was pretty good, pretty animated. So where are we in the polls? Is this just reversion? I know it's tightened messaging. What's the latest here?
Well, just quickly on the weird comment sort of theme of the week, it could be reminiscent of Hillary Clinton's use of deplorables, which is something that played well initially, but hindsight, I think she probably regretted saying. So we'll see. When you sort of tack the other side with that label, a lot of people would take offense to that. So that's something to see playing out. In terms of the polls, use the word mean reversion. I think that's a good way or phrase to describe it. That was something that Amy Walter rather from the Cook Political Report used. And I think in terms of this, where your baseline is important context. I mean, we're essentially where we were if you look at the polls and the betting markets in May, prior to the June debate that led to Biden's dropping out of the race. So my sense is just based on that, Harris has brought a lot of these Democrats back home. When you get into the polls, maybe there's some more from these younger voters of colors we talked about, maybe at the expense of older voters, these working class white voters, which could be important when you look at these battleground states. But it should be surprising. We live in a very polarized country. So I think the idea that with candidates sort of being around the mid 40s to me sort of makes sense. And I think one of the things to keep in context for Democrats is playing to an even draw doesn't help you because Biden, I believe, won the 2020 election with a 5% margin on the national polls, but he barely won, if you recall the battleground states. So I think Democrats, again, being tied with Trump are only up 2 or 3%, probably not going to be enough to get you there. States that I'm watching in particular are Pennsylvania and Georgia. If you just do the math, Trump carries all the states he won in 2020, which I think seems like a pretty low bar. Trump wins those states, Georgia and Pennsylvania, states that he won in 2016. He gets to 270, he wins. And my guess is that may influence Kamala Harris's selection here on the vice presidential side. You asked me about, what to watch next week. I believe she's going to make that announcement on Tuesday. And if you look at the betting odds, it seems overwhelming right now. At least I've predicted 68% in terms of going to Harris. I think the Keystone State is the keystone for the Democrats in their pathway to presidency. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about it right now.
Let me ask you a question right down the middle, and I don't know the answer to this. Was she soft on crime or was she tough on crime?
I think it's like a lot of things in terms of her past is a lot of people can point to different things and argue a different way. I think that's going to be something to watch moving forward too, is both sides will try to define Kamala Harris. And you look back at her positions that she took when she was running in the Democratic presidential primary in 2020. And a lot of them at the time were sort of running in this crowded progressive lane. So the ban on fracking, Medicare for all, or lenient, is a polite way of putting it, border policy. Now, she's now trying to distance herself from that, I think, in terms of appealing to a more moderate general election audience. Republicans are going to have the burden of trying to explain, and I think it's going to be more analogous to what they did to John Kerry in 2004. You remember the time the Massachusetts liberal sort of being out of touch, too extreme. Now you're seeing similar language with respect to trying to define Harris as sort of a radical San Francisco politician. And it's just kind of hit her over the head for flip-flopping. Well, this was your position now, this is your position then. It's a credibility concern. I think that's something they were already started looking to play into with respect to comments Harris made about Biden's health. So whether or not they can be effective in getting that message out there, whether they're going to have to work against a media that may not be inclined to get that message out there, will, I think, be the thing to watch moving forward and see how that impacts the polls.
Yeah, yeah, she definitely seems to flip flop, but you can absolutely see the
Flip flops on her ethnicity too. Oh wait, sorry, did I step into that grenade?
Yeah, well, you fall on that grenade a lot. The question from that we see around here just is that resurgence. I mean, definitely this kind of low energy level, and in our circles can definitely see people more spirited. Let's call it that way about.
It's a relief rally. It's a relief that Biden's
Without
not at the
question.
top of the ticket. And
Yeah.
your point, you're seeing the enthusiasm and sort of this, at this point, extended honeymoon period. I mean, I'll give her campaign an A so far for the rollout.
Yeah.
Overall, she had a really good rollout during her 2020 presidential, but can you sustain it?
Right.
And you get more scrutiny. And if we actually do get a debate or two, potentially, that's going to be something to watch moving forward. I mean, you can make the case that she's become a better candidate. We will see from 2020. I know other people that I guess are still sort of skeptical as to how much she may have improved because of her performance then.
Well, I mean, she certainly didn't exemplify it as a vice president. I mean, she had the worst poll ratings ever, right? I mean, that's what is, I think, laughable about the media, which is they were quick to talk about that, how bad her polling was, and now it's just gone, right? They don't talk about it at all. Somehow there's this magic wand that at the top of the ticket you're going to be this effective leader, but as the VP, you were a complete dud.
They were also quick to not talk about Biden's concerns over his age until they became visible to everybody that watched that debate. So
yeah. Now they've completely lost her credibility and continue to do so almost on a daily basis. Neil, what's on the docket next week? What are you watching?
Well, it's actually a fairly quiet week after all the data that came out this week. We're going to get the ISM services number. That'll be for July. We did get a very weak manufacturing ISM employment this week, and maybe that was a precursor to this week jobs number that we got this morning. But so we get ISM services. The senior loan officer survey is also on deck. And that's really it. I'll be keeping a close eye on the jobless claims data. Obviously, jobless claims have been inching higher in recent weeks, and I think it's okay to talk about certain special factors, whether it's auto retooling in Michigan or law changes in Minnesota. We had the hurricane effect in Texas, but at the end of the day, you look at the 4-week average to kind of smooth through that noise, and that's moving higher as well. And continuing claims are also going up. They're running close to 1.9 million. So I think initial claims take on more significance now, given what we saw in this jobs number. And then I'll be keeping a close eye next week on what Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee is going to be saying. He's speaking later today. I mean, so we'll see what he says. But this guy's a dove, right? I mean, he's been out in front relative to most of them about the risks. So it's going to be interesting to see how much he leans into it right now. He did vote with everyone else. I mean, there was a unanimous decision to hold off in July, but he was voting, sort of as an alternate because Loretta Mester's not there anymore. But he's been dovish, and so I'm curious to actually see what he has to say now that this number's come out and that they just made the decision, because it's hard not to come to the conclusion that the Fed does look a little bit foolish. So I'm curious to see how he kind of handles that, considering he was one of the people that voted to wait.
Yeah, right. The messaging. What do we have, Steve, out of DC next week?
Well, we talked about Harris making her VP selection on Tuesday. Congress is now adjourned, so we won't have to, I guess, worry as much about them at least till September. But looking abroad, I think we have some instability around the world, geopolitical front. in the Middle East, fear of an escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. And then we have a disputed election result there in Venezuela. And so if I'm concerned about oil and energy supply, that'd be something I'd continue to keep an eye on.
Well, we're going to watch this shift to see the continuation of it. But I think 10-year yields are important. You know, we got down today to what we thought was a target for the end of the year. So clearly that's happening much more quickly than we were anticipating, which was 380 on the 10-year yield. You know, much below that, and you're talking about the next support being 325. And I think you start getting into that realm. And you know, we might snap some landing gear off of this landing. So we'll watch that. 415 is the upside. That's the resistance level. And then on the S&P, important support at 5192. You know, keep in mind, we did have a good breadth acceleration back a couple weeks ago. Those tend to have good duration to them out the next 3 to 6 months, not as strong in the very near term. So the next couple weeks still be bumpy around that, along with seasonality, still in an uptrend, but obviously the dynamics have shifted here away from cyclicality. One of the things to watch, just as a very kind of canary in the coal mine, if you will, is the performance of discretionary versus staples. So you want to see discretionary hold its head up versus staples. If that starts to flip, then that's an indication that you've got weaker things ahead and the market's discounting that. So we'll be attuned to that as we go forward. Join us again next week. We'll be 1 week older, 1 week wiser. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and RenMac.com. RenMacAccess.com, that is, if you want deeper insights into some of our work. Until then, I'm Jeff DeGraff.
I'm Neil Dutta.
And I'm Steve Pavlik.
We'll see you.